Welcome, Wargamers. This is Doug with 2 Plus Stuff, and today we're doing something a little special. I've talked about doing it a few times. We're going to be diving into the end times and how that kind of concluded the storyline for Warhammer Fantasy Battles and brought us into the Age of Sigmar. Now, in truth, most of the videos I do are requested specifically by people. This isn't one that was specifically requested. However, a lot of the questions y'all ask tie into the topics, like, for example, whatever happened to blank? Well, you have to understand where they were at the end times and kind of things like that. So they all kind of intermingle. It answers a few questions for a lot of people, and so that's kind of why I want to do it. Now, before I begin, there are a few prefaces to this conversation that need to be had. The biggest one being that I'm going to talk about the End Times series as if you are new to Age of Sigmar and didn't really have much experience with Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Or if you're, coming to Age of Sigmar and you did play Fantasy Battles, but you weren't around for the End Times, that kind of idea where you really have no idea. It's been mentioned to you, but you're not sure. It's more informational. To that end, these are massive books, so I will be, like always with all the old world lore, abbreviating it, making it a little bit shorter, more easier to consume. So I just wanted to kind of preface that there, so I'm not going to go into massive detail on every single thing. I also want to point out that during the End Times scenario, several factions and specifically named characters that people really treasured over the years were removed from the GW line and also the storyline. And so, frankly, this story and series is very sensitive to some people. Some people still get really aggravated and agitated when they talk about the fact that the old world is gone and that their army is no longer being supported narratively, things like that. So I want to preface it and address those people head on and say I'm not going to shy away from those things at all. I also have my fair share of disappointments. But again, the purpose of this video is just to educate people who are new to the hobby. When someone says after the end times, what does that actually mean? And the last of my little heads ups before I begin, whether you are someone who played during the actual end times as the books were being released in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, or you're a new player who is trying to understand what's going on, above all, this conversation in the comment section below needs to be one of respect. People are not dumb because they enjoy Age of Sigmar and weren't grasped by the old world, and people are not fools if they are like me, who I enjoyed playing Warhammer Fantasy Battles and now I enjoy Age of Sigmar. Nor are they dumb if they really, really loved Warhammer Fantasy Battles and genuinely don't like Age of Sigmar. Those are the three kind of variations that people walk away from. All of them are right if you're just enjoying yourself. And this is a hobby, and we should all just respect one another and the things that we enjoy. Okay, so with all those out of the way, what I want to do is start by saying, what was the End Times series? Well, if you're new, there was once a game called Warhammer Fantasy Battles. GW supported this for roughly 30 years, and it was a rank and file army battle game. If you've ever seen, I'm trying to think of an iconic scene in Braveheart where they all kind of line up on the hills, and generals and stuff use flags to communicate in these huge blocks of 30 and 20 horsemen and a bunch of spear guys. They kind of coordinate. If you ever played the Total War games, very much like that, like line-based infantry. Very similar to what Warhammer Fantasy Battles was. Narratively speaking, it took place on pretty much a carbon copy of Earth, where they kind of remapped it to have these like fantasy races. Oh, this is where the orcs are, this is where the high elves are, and all the elven Civil War junk took place on what is basically England, or at least the English Isles. The Tomb Kings were, I believe they were like where Egypt is now, if I'm not mistaken. I know that Africa, I think, was Lustria, so lizard men. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have the map anymore. I had it on my wall for years, but I took it down when we moved. And so Warhammer Fantasy Battles and all the Warhammer books before Age of Sigmar were this story of all these various factions trying to, one, survive, and then two, ultimately fight off chaos. But then there was just so many grand stories in between those things that made them really, really unique. Now, Games Workshop, as a company, wanted to take the storyline of Warhammer Fantasy Battles in a different direction. The game mechanically became very bloated, and that you can see now with the release of 8th edition 40K, the company is changing, and so they started with Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And what they did to kind of conclude the massive, the meta story, if you will, of that universe, was kind of end it with an epic series of battles where all of everyone's wildest dreams kind of come true in terms of combat, and they call this a 5-book series called the End Times. Each one of these books has kind of a titular character, a main villain, if you will, and then they all demonstrate a different way in which the world is coming undone. And we'll get into those one by one here a little bit, but they're all deeply fascinating. They are beautiful. They are made with extreme high levels of quality, and a lot of work went into each and every one of these books. They're very cool. If you find one at like half-price books or something like that, pick it up just because they're really great. It's also important to note that for those of us who got into the game at Age of Sigmar and never had any exposure to fantasy battles, some of the most iconic models that we have for Age of Sigmar were actually released during the End Times. I'll highlight some of them. I know I didn't catch them all because the pages don't have release dates on them, so I know I missed one or two, but I'll highlight the ones that I think really, really stand out. Okay, so the first book was called Times Nagesh. I'm going to skip the End Times in the name of each of these books, but it was just called Nagesh. And this really chronicles the resurrection of the great necromancer Nagesh. Now, I do have a link down in the description where I have a lore video on him, and in that video I described that he was the equivalent of an ancient Egyptian king priest type guy. He was kind of the master of death magic in his day. He had died and been resurrected multiple times, but this time was something special because they basically, for plot reasons, found a way to make him reborn in his most powerful state. A long portion of the first half of the book was just literally the Mortarchs, who actually did come into Sigmar. So that's Manfred, Neferata, and what's the last one? Archon. Did all of the steps necessary and got all of the items and everything like that to bring Nagesh back to life. So it's a very detailed story of how they made these things happen, orchestrated these events to make it come to fruition. Once Nagesh is resurrected, he immediately starts an all-out war of the undead. So for those of us who, like I said, are new to Age of Sigmar, there once was a race called the Tomb Kings, which were kind of an offshoot of death armies. And while the main death faction that we know of now identify with was kind of in the Transylvania vampire-ish area, because like I said, everything's kind of a real-world equivalent. So they're up in the Transylvania area. The other undead people were down in Egypt. Nagesh, who resurrects in Transylvania, promptly goes down to the Egyptian part and consumes the entire army. As we discussed in the lore video for Nagesh, he had built a giant black pyramid, and so he goes down to that area of the world, basically turns that black pyramid into a giant siphon and starts sucking in all the death energy. He kind of becomes the focal point of all death magic in the entire planet. He strikes down all of the heroes and leaders of the Tomb Kings, takes absolute control of all their troops, so now his army is just magnified and massive. It really does set him as this super villain in the first book. It was one of the most exciting books to come out in that game for a long time. Now, as he's doing these things, the world starts to change. And it's actually something I really liked about the book series, that every book had something that kind of affected the planet as a whole. For his, the death magic being, yes, it was all channeled to him, but all across the world, it was just kind of booming. And so dead everywhere kind of began to rise. Now, traditionally in Warhammer Fantasy battles, the idea of necromancy was pretty cool, where magic would bring someone to life, quote unquote, but they'd be mindless. And so it was up to the necromancer to exert his will over that dead person, so that's how you gain control. So now you just have these dead people, zombies raising, that don't have a master, so it's kind of wandering, right? And so kind of rules-wise, what made it really, really cool is that everyone got to use death magic. Everyone got to have zombies under their control. There were a few characters throughout the End Time series that were experimenting with necromancy as maybe a means to saving the world. We'll just buff up our armies with expendable troops and things like that. And so it became really, really cool that they so heavily drew in elements of death magic into everything. Obviously, if you're keeping score, this is where we got the Nagesh model. I think the Spirit Hosts and the Morghast Archai, and obviously the Mortarchs as well. A lot of the revised leaders of the Death Army came from this release. Okay, so that was End Times Nagesh. Now, the second book to come out was End Times Glotkin. Guess who stars this one? So Glotkin begins with actually one of our favorite characters, Archaon. And he kind of orchestrates the first steps to ending the world. Okay, Archaon is the architect. He is the ender of worlds. That's kind of his title in Age of Sigmar as well. So he kind of starts putting this plan in motion. And the first part of that plan was absolutely destroying the empires of man who would oppose him, right? Because he knows mankind, when they're unified, they're really, really good, like a worthy opponent. So he needs to knock them down a peg. So Archaon, having access to the champions of all Chaos Gods, brings forth the Glotkin, who we actually just covered in a different lore video, and I'll link that as well. And the Glotkin leads a huge, unaligned Chaos army, because like it's mostly Nurgle stuff, but there is actually a few Khorne guys assigned to be with him, so it's an unaligned Chaos army, functionally, and then leads them into some of the capital cities of the Empire. Now, this doesn't really mean much to people who never really played much in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, but some of like the most important cities and so that ones that have appeared in stories for almost 3 decades, they're getting knocked down and just completely overrun. So the impact was very dramatic, very, very powerful. In the end, however, this massive snowball of Glotkin and massive army, they actually get struck down. The Emperor of Man, whose name was Karl Franz at the time, was able to strike down the Glotkin's armies. But in the end of the book, it comes out that Archaon is standing there talking about it, and he really doesn't care that they lost because they took so much out with them that, you know, the Empire exists but is functionally crippled, so it's like there's not much of a challenge left. Now, what's interesting is that in that last battle where the Glotkin's army lost, it was because mankind was actually reinforced by some of the Mortarks and Death guys from Nagash's army. So there's like different plans and machinations, right? Nagash doesn't want chaos to rule, so he sent some of his Mortarks over to help the empires of man. And so now what we're seeing is, instead of like these 16 different factions that all just want various things, they kind of position Death in a unique way where it's different than what we would now as an Order army, but it is not always their enemy, but it's not always their friend. So I think this is kind of the first inkling of grand alliances that we ever got. Of course, in-game, this introduced some iconic models, the Glotkin, obviously. I believe Gutrot Spoom came out at the same time as well. Also the Blight Kings, which was an amazing kit, and it still is. Okay, so the third book in this series is called End Times Cain. Now, Cain is a bit unique, and people, I find, either love it or they don't like it at all. Cain basically takes a break from the main storyline of Archaon's plan to end the world and Nagash's kind of weird interactions with mankind to kind of stop that and, you know, the opposition of chaos. And Cain focuses exclusively on the elven factions in the universe, right? So imagine we have a view of the whole globe, and all of a sudden End Times Cain just kind of zooms in really heavily on the British Isles, UK, if you will. I don't know which they prefer anymore. And in this book, we're going to cover the utter decimation of the elven race. Now, when I say elves, I'm talking about the high elves, wood elves, and dark elves of the old world. One of the high elves is a master wizard named Teclis. And Teclis could see what was happening on kind of like an ethereal level. Like, he knew, maybe not Archaon specifically, but chaos was in ascension. Things were going really, really, really bad. And he was kind of coming up with a master plan on how to stop this. He had an idea. In the old world, there were 8 winds of magic, each discipline of magic, and he had this plan where if I bind one of the winds of magic to a hero, a champion, right, and there's actually 8 of them, so I have 8 heroes. If I bind one to each of them, then we could fight as a united force to stop chaos, right? Basically, you build up your A team and then have this team go out and fight Archaon. Well, you kind of get in the way of his plan at this point in time. The winds of magic were kind of bound and funneled and channeled through a vortex that actually existed on the island that all the elves lived in. So this obviously means that the first step of doing that is he has to break that bind, so now the winds of magic are all out, and then he can also take them and basically assign them to a hero, right? It's a lot of information to take in. It's a completely different mindset, so just kind of bear with me. But he's trying to undo this vortex that has all the magic kind of funneled and channeled and in control, I think, is more the thing. Like, all the magic is toned down, in control, stable, and he has to make all hell break loose so that he can bind the magic to a particular person. Well, when he does this, the island kind of falls apart and chaos goes ballistic. Keep in mind, I'm talking about Teclis having this plan of like, oh yeah, I'll just unbind the spells and, I'll make some heroes and it'll be great. The thing is that there is a colossal elven civil war happening continuously for thousands of years around him. So there are iconic characters from all these armies, like I said, Wood Elves, High Elves, Dark Elves, that are all in this fight, and it culminates in some amazingly epic battles. When the vortex is like undone, chaos just goes, like I said, absolutely nuts. The slaughter, the killing, what it actually does, it's this way the story describes it is Slaanesh is drinking in elven souls faster than he can handle. Okay, he loves their souls, particularly that race particularly stands out to him as being like delicious, I guess you would say. And so this wholesale slaughter of this epic civil war clash, as well as the destabilization of the island, killing people, Slaanesh drinks in thousands upon thousands upon thousands of souls at once. So many of you have asked what happened to Slaanesh at the end times. I'm telling you right now, okay? The only information we have up to this point is that Slaanesh ate literally so much that it bloated and had to take a beat. Okay, we don't know what happened to it afterwards. This is the last time we see Slaanesh in the old world. It's just like this all consumption. Okay, the next time we talk about Slaanesh is in the Age of Sigmar war book, where basically after eating so much he took a power nap, like you do after a buffet, and whatever remnants of elves actually captured him. And so we'll get to that in a different video about Slaanesh that I want to do. But functionally right now, Slaanesh is really loving life, absolutely decimating elven armies. All that to say, Teclis' plan actually works, and begins basically binding the pure, unfiltered magic power to certain people. Now, some of them already had ones that you would guess. So Nagesh is death, Alario's life, Sigmar's heavens, Teclis' light, and Malekith, who was the leader of the Dark Elves, is shadows. In terms of plot, it was probably one of the harder books to understand, but it was actually coupled by having some of the best campaigns, I thought, because the scope of it was much smaller, meaning it's just that chain of islands. I felt like the campaign system was a lot more fun. It was a great book. In game, basically the biggest thing that we got, and people hated it, was new rules for Magic, where the Chaos Realm was such in flux and things were coming apart that you'd roll to see if you got a spell and half your army would blow off the board, or your guy would go Super Saiyan or something ridiculous would happen. It was just a crazy set of rules they put out with it. All right, book number 4 was End Times Thanquol, which is my absolute favorite of the End Times books by a large margin. And really what this captures is the rise of the Skaven as a power player in the universe. And really, before I go any further, I want to kind of summarize it. This book is like every Skaven player took a huge shot, I don't know, of LSD or something, and just kind of wrote out their wildest dreams of what they thought Skaven could be or whatever. Let me just roll off a few things that they do in this book, okay? They literally blow up the moon, okay? The moon in the old world is where a lot of warpstone came from. And so we can't go to the moon, we make the moon come to us. And so they literally built a giant cannon and shot the moon, blew it up. So now, on top of Nagesh coming, massive armies of chaos and destabilization of the planet because of the vortex, because of the elves, now there's colossal meteors and all this crashing into Earth. Huge portions of the Lizardman army is just wiped off the map by some of these things. It's absolutely unreal. They destroy a major human settlement, the city of Nuln, which was a large weapons producer, so that's kind of important for that reason. They flood the dwarven capital, where the dwarves used to be, or dwarven now, but used to be dwarves, and they destroy the Lizardmen by taking over them and corrupting them with plague monks and just making them dead by toxins, yeah. What's crazy is when you read about the parts of the story that have to do with the dwarves, there's a small side story where this dwarf gets separated from his unit and he's just kind of wandering around some of the caves that they had after the fight, and he accidentally stumbles into basically the breeding pit for Skaven, and he sees that there's just hundreds of thousands of Skaven being bred, and so it kind of dawns on me the Skaven are an extinction level event at this point. Yeah, so this is probably one of the one book where like there's literally no downside, right? All the other books, everybody at least takes someone on the chin. Skaven do not. Okay, like this book is just pure. That's why I said it's like a drug-induced, what every Skaven player thinks that they're going to do. This is exactly what it is. It's incredible. As far as in-game content, with the Thankful release, we got the Verminlord kit. We got the Thankful and Bone Ripper set. He was kind of the main character behind some of those things that I had mentioned earlier. And the last book in the End Times series is the End Times Archaon. And really what this is, very, very simply, it details the completion of Archaon's plan to destroy the old world. Now, here's the thing. This is the first, I think, book where we got a taste of what Age of Sigmar is going to be like. And here's what I mean. A lot of abstract things. A lot of the old world lore was very traditional magic, things that we understand. That the physics generally work the same and things like that. So when we start talking about what Archaon's plan was, it's kind of hard to understand because I can't tell you I fully grasp it. I've reread the end of that book 3 times now, and I struggle. Functionally, what he does is he opens up a giant warp rift that engulfs the entire planet in reality itself. While this is going on, there's several massive battles happening between the remnants of basically all the living factions. Of course, all of the people that Teclis had assigned Winds of Magic to, so basically just about all the people that we know as gods in Age of Sigmar, where they're fighting Archaon at the end. This massive battle kind of boils down to Archaon fighting Sigmar in person, hand to hand. Now what I found interesting is that after Archaon starts the ritual, he doesn't really want to be sucked in, but he started something that's going to basically engulf all of known reality. So I'm not quite sure. I wish they had kind of explained more why he was doing what he did, and what if he had a particular goal in mind in doing so, or if it really was just to take everything down with him in the biggest middle finger in the known universe. And that could be it. That sounds like him, to be honest with you. What's important is that when we look at what happened after the End Times, and what was set up for Age of Sigmar, in the end, the old world is destroyed. The gods of Age of Sigmar are established. Chaos takes a beat. It kind of turns away, like the world's gone, so there's nothing for them to fight over. So they turn away, satisfied, Slanesh being uber satisfied because he ate too much. And Archaon stands out as really the true winner. By that I mean all of his plans came to fruition, and if it really was just about hating everything so much that he wanted to take out everything with him, he did exactly what he set out to do. And the last scene that we get with the End Times Archaon is this idea that there is still hope. I believe it closes with the idea of Sigmar hanging on to the core of the old world. Now, why am I talking about this? Why are these books important and things like that? Well, there actually was a Facebook post from Games Workshop. I think it was in reply to somebody else's comment. They were a little disgruntled on how things went down with the End Times. And they viewed the End Times as being a proper send-off, a very epic campaign send-off to the old world, introducing Age of Sigmar. And to some extent, I understand that. They weren't clear that the game was going to fundamentally change in the way it did, so a lot of folks spent a lot of money on these books and were ultimately like, oh, they're not even relevant really anymore. They are incredible books. They have a ton of quality in them and great stories. I enjoyed the series quite a bit, and I played Warhammer Fantasy Battles. I had a High Elf army. Really, really enjoyed the whole series. It was really great. But I do completely understand why people are upset, and they have legitimate reasons for being upset, and I'm not going to bash on them whatsoever. Really what I think it kind of makes the End Times book so cool is just what I said at the end there. It establishes the important characters, the important players in Age of Sigmar as we know now, and kind of gives us a little bit of context for some of the more narrative-based rules and choices that some of these factions have. And while everyone has their opinion on how they should have ended it or what they should have done, the fact of the matter is this is what they did. And so that concludes my kind of thoughts and recap on what the End Times was for you newer folks who are kind of curious. It is the conclusion of one grand arcing storyline that spanned 30 years of Games Workshop history. And so concluded with a really, really epic campaign series and then changed into the game that we have now. I want to reiterate one more time that if you have an opinion about this, I would absolutely love to hear it. I do want things in the comment section to be respectful to people who are new, people who don't play anymore, people who played both like myself. Above all, We're here to enjoy our hobby and be respectful to one another. If you have a lore topic you'd like to hear about, please click subscribe, leave it in the comments down below. I read every single comment and I try to respond to as many as possible. Of course, there are a lot more of you than there are of me. I thank you so much for the amount of encouragement I've gotten since I kind of started recording lore videos with a new microphone. I've really been enjoying it quite a bit. And above all, I just want to thank you all so much for watching me your day. Enjoy your hobby and happy wargaming.